Yes, I'll introduce you.
All right.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the National Biodiversity Teach-In. This is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And next on our lineup is Bronwyn Hogan, and she's going to share with us information about bats. Let's go Batty for bats. Thank you very much for joining us today, Bronwyn.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bronwyn Hogan, and I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'm going to talk about bats. So let's go Batty for bats. All right. One of the first questions I often get when I talk to someone about what I do for my job is, you work with what? And then I used to get this when I first started working with bats. Oh, that's gross, but not so much anymore. Now I get, oh, that's cool. Oh, I really like that. So that's been an exciting change that's happened in the time since I started working with bats. So let me talk real briefly before I get into the bat part about what I actually do for work. So I am the white nose syndrome and North American bat monitoring coordinator for my region, which is California and Nevada. And about half of my job is spent on that kind of work, doing things with bats. The other half of my job, I do more general conservation planning and mitigation planning and things like that. So a lot of my work is with other agencies, tribes, the public, to plan bat conservation and research. I do a lot of work on the computer, a lot of work on the phone. My kids used to call me a computer biologist, which I would grumble at them about. And occasionally I do go into a lab to check bats for signs of white nose syndrome. When I do get to go outside, which we haven't been doing a lot of right now because field work that requires close contact with other people, obviously we're being really careful about. I work with biologists and other types of scientists on bat research projects. And one of the big things that we're doing now is to get acoustic monitoring projects set up. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because acoustic monitoring you can do essentially by yourself, and it doesn't require handling animals or being close to people. So working with bats. Well, a lot of times people say, well, how did you get started working with bats? And or how can I start working with bats? And I think a lot of people think, you have to study biology, ecology, wildlife management. All of those are avenues and good fields to study in school or in college if you do want to work with bats. However, I do know a couple of researchers who got into bats through an interest in physics or an interest in engineering. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. When I first started, there weren't a lot of bat-specific labs in universities, but now there are a number of places where they have a group of bat researchers. So if you are interested or thinking about college and wanting to study bats, it's worth looking for where there might be universities that have bat labs. I kind of fell into bat work. I got my undergrad in wildlife and fisheries biology at UC Davis, and I was a general wildlife biologist working for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, used to be Fish and Game. When just on a whim, I took a week-long field class with a colleague and to learn about the biology and conservation of California bats, and I really fell in love with them. So I decided to go back to school to get my master's degree in conservation biology, studying bats. And yeah, that's how I got into it. I pretty much, once I took that class, I thought this is really what I want to focus my my work on. So that research in the old days was hard. We didn't have the tech. Well, I wasn't alive back then, but folks didn't have technology. They, if they came across bats roosting and they could see them up close, they could study them that way. But if they wanted to know what species were flying around over their head or were in an area, they often resorted to shooting them. And I can't remember Kellogg's first name, but he in 1916 said, there is nothing more wasteful of ammunition than shooting at bats. So happily, we have lots of tools now that can allow us to study bats. We have mist nets, which are very thin nets that are hard to detect for the bats, and they're also used for birds, to catch birds. Night vision allows us to actually watch after dark when we can't really see very well and watch the bats flying or see what they're doing. And then recently there's been an explosion of work using acoustic monitoring techniques. And acoustic monitoring is basically, jumping ahead, a way to hear bats that we wouldn't necessarily be able to. And this is an example of what you get on your computer screen when you look at bat calls. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so what makes bats special? I'm going to do kind of a general overview of bats. Some of you may have heard this before, but that's okay. I think it's always fun to hear about bats again, but hopefully some of this might be new information. So bats are not rodents. They are not primates. Some people think that when they look at some of the species of bats. And most people do think that they're kind of closely related to rodents if they don't know much about it. But in fact, bats are more closely related to primates than to rodents, even though, a lot of times bats can kind of look like mice. They are the only flying mammal, the only truly flying mammal, and they're the longest lived mammal for their size. The oldest known wild bat was at least 41 years old when it was last recaptured because it had been banded as an adult. So they know it was at least 1 year old when it was banded, and they caught it again 41 years later, or 40 years later. They use echolocation to navigate, communicate, and hunt, and I'll talk a little more about echolocation. Not all bats use echolocation, but most of them do. And they are in their own scientific order called Chiroptera. Chiroptera means hand wing, and I really like this graphic. I don't know if you can see my pointer. If you can, I'm going to use it. So basically, they have all the same bones that we have in our arm and hand, but the finger bones are elongated. They have a thumb that they use to hold on to things, to climb and to groom. They have all the same arm and finger bones that we do, but again, they're elongated, and they have two thin layers of, like paper thin layers of skin, and that creates the wing. So there are over 1,400 species of bats worldwide. I thought that it was 1,416, but I think we just have confirmed a new species of bat in Africa. It's a beautiful bat. If I have time, I'll put a link in the, maybe I can get Frankie a link. Anyway, if you look up new bat species, I didn't write down the name. It's an orange and black bat, and they found it in a mountain range in Africa. And that was super exciting. It's really amazing to still be finding new species that hadn't been described by, by Western science. So bats are 1/5 of all mammal species. So if you took all the mammals in the world and put them in a big space, and one out of every 5 of them would be a bat. They live in almost every place on Earth except extreme desert and polar regions. And there are 2 major groups. So there are Megachiroptera or megabats, and there are Microchiroptera or microbats. The megabats only live in the old world tropics. The microbats are found anywhere in the world where there are bats. And the megabats are also known as flying foxes. I always like to talk about extremes. So the smallest known bat is the bumblebee bat, or Kitty's hog-nosed bat. It's the smallest mammal in the world, again, that we know of. It weighs less than a penny, and it has a 3-inch wingspan, and they live in Thailand and Burma. I'm going to make a note about the fact that this picture shows someone holding a bat with a bare hand. There aren't very many pictures of the bumblebee bat, and generally now we don't handle bats without gloves, partly because people are concerned about getting bitten by bats, but these bats are so small that they can hardly even bite you. But a lot of it is to protect the bats from anything we might be carrying. So I just want to say that I don't think I have any other pictures of people holding bats with bare hands, but I just wanted to make a note that that's not something we bat researchers do anymore. The biggest bats are the tropical pteropid bats, also, as I said, called flying foxes. And this is a golden crowned flying fox that can have a 6-foot wingspan, and they live in the Philippines. I often get the question, what's the cutest bat? And in my opinion, the Honduran tent-making bats are the cutest in the microbat category. These bats chew along the rib of big tropical forest leaves, and then the leaf kind of droops down over them, and it creates a tent that protects them from the rain and helps them keep warm. Then I think flying fox pups are just super cute. And here's an Australian spectacled flying fox hanging out with its mom. All right, so I talked before that one of the things that makes bats special is echolocation. So not all bats in the world use echolocation. Many of the megabats use eyesight and smell. And in fact, even some of the microbats, we have a species in North America called the pallid bat that uses eyesight a lot to hunt, so they can sneak up on prey, and including things like scorpions. But all of the bats that we have in the US use echolocation. Blind as a bat, which is sometimes, people say, oh, you're blind as a bat, or bats can't see. That's not true. Actually, many of them have eyesight that's as good as ours, but they do use echolocation when they're out flying around in the dark looking for food and trying to navigate around trees or buildings or whatever is in their way. So unfortunately, I had a snafu with my PowerPoint. My computer connecting to work security system decided that it didn't think this PowerPoint was safe. So it's not letting me play the sounds that I had on this slide. But essentially, bats will send out sound, and that sound pulse hits something, as you can see in this little corner piece. It hits a moth, and then it bounces back to the bat. And the bat essentially gets a mental picture gets a sound picture of distance from the object, the texture of the object, the movement, direction, speed, and it allows them to hunt small objects and avoid small or big things that might be in their way. So in the search phase, they're just sending out constant pulses, just like a pulse, a pulse, a pulse. But as they get closer to an insect, the echoes are coming back more quickly, so they're sending out the pulses more quickly. And you can tell that bats are hunting because they have what's called a feeding buzz or a terminal buzz. And so that sound gets faster and faster, faster. And at the very end of their string of calls, you hear sort of a zoop, and then it stops. And hopefully the bat caught the insect. Sometimes they don't, and then they'll just take off again, sending out those regular search phase calls. And this is one way that you can display bat calls on a sonogram. There are a couple of different ways that you can look at them and evaluate what the bats are doing and what species they might be. Okay, one thing that I wanted to say really quickly is dolphins and whales also use echolocation. It's a similar idea, except it's in water instead of in the air. And I wanted to mention that humans can hear a range of 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So kilohertz are higher in frequency. Bat calls are usually pitched too high for adult humans to hear, but if you have really good high frequency hearing, and kids often can hear bats. So if you're someplace where bats are flying around, you might hear a little kind of tick, tick, tick sound, and that's actually the bats echolocating. But usually you can't hear very much of that. Okay, so I think that, I'm not going to be able to play those calls, so let me move on. Okay, so bats, why are bats important? Why should we care about protecting them? Well, there are a lot of reasons. They are hard at work around the world. They are providing us with ecosystem services such as pest control for crops like corn, tomatoes, watermelons, and they're considered to save billions of dollars for farmers every year, basically eating insects that otherwise the farmers would need to use some kind of pesticides to control. They eat insects like mosquitoes that can be disease vectors for humans. They feed on pollen and nectar, and while doing that, they pollinate plants like avocados, bananas, cashews, agave, and they disperse seeds. And in the tropics, they're actually considered really critical for forest regeneration in places where trees have been cut down. The bats will actually eat the fruit and either spit out the seeds or poop out the seeds. And either way, they're also giving a little bit of fertilizer for the seeds, and they're considered really important for regeneration. So let's talk a little bit more about what bats are eating. So most of them in the world eat insects. About 2/3 of the bats in the world eat insects. Others, as I said, eat pollen, fruit, or nectar. A few eat meat. They're carnivorous, and they will hunt frogs and fish. In fact, the fish-eating bats have really long toes that they use to kind of scoop through the water, and they will catch fish that are at the surface. And then 3 species of bats who live in Latin America, Central America and Mexico, and I think into South America as well, feed on blood. They're not like we see in the vampire movies. They don't come and attack you and suck your blood. They actually have razor sharp teeth. And again, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but if you look at the bat in the picture, the lower picture, see how it kind of looks like it has little buck teeth? Those are actually flattened and sharp like a razor blade. So they essentially give like a shaving cut on whatever animal they're feeding on. 2 of the species actually are adapted to feed on sleeping birds. So the birds are sleeping and the bats will creep along a branch and then give them a little nick on their foot and lap the blood up, kind of just like they're lapping up water. And then they actually go back to their colony, and they're super social. They're really interesting animals. If you're at all interested in behavior or physiology, interesting physiology, it's worth looking up vampire bats and looking up some research on them. And I'd be happy to give you some info on that if you'd like later. Again, insect-eating bats are a primary predator of night-flying insects. Often they specialize in different kinds of insects. Some eat moths, some eat beetles, some eat flies. And this is why they're so important to farmers. They can eat their body weight in insects in one night. Bats, granted, are small, but that would be like me eating 50 large pizzas or 500 hamburgers, which just is amazing to me. So they're really important to science. Aside from their benefits, their ecosystem service benefits, they have a lot of really amazing adaptations that we're studying to see if we can use any of those or learn from them to do things with our technology. So the military has studied bat flight and navigation. They're working on like robots that are bat flight adapted because they're so maneuverable. In medicine, there was an anticoagulant in vampire bat saliva that was discovered, and it was used to create medicine for stroke victims, which they named vampirin. Also, and I know viruses have been in the news a lot lately, bats are really resistant to viruses. And so we're doing a lot of people are working on how bats are able to live with these viruses and not be impacted by them. So they really have a lot of things to teach us, and we can learn a lot from them in different areas of our world. Okay, so quickly, bats in the United States, we have 47 species of bats. They are almost all insectivores, so they eat insects. That's about 90% of them. We do have a few fruit, nectar, and pollen-eating bats that live in the southwestern US. And if you think about it, you really can't be a fruit, nectar, or pollen-eating bat in a lot of places in the US because we don't have fruit, nectar, or pollen in the winter. So those bats that eat insects sometimes can make it all the way through the winter. There are some places that have, insects around, but mostly they got to figure out something to do in the winter when there aren't very many insects and there certainly isn't fruit, nectar, or pollen. So one of the things that bats do is hibernate. They need a cold location, and this is often caves and mines, but it turns out that bats will also hibernate in places like under the roots of big trees in Alaska, or in the spaces between rocks and talus slopes, those slopes that are just like real rocky. I don't know if you've ever tried to climb up one of those slopes that's like bouldery or has, rocks that there are spaces in between. They will actually hibernate in those spaces, and often that ends up being under snow for months. The snow probably helps insulate and keep the temperature of that location constant, and that's really important because they're basically slowing down their body functions, including breathing, heart rate, body temperature, and they're doing that in order to conserve and not use all their fat stores too fast so that they can make it through the whole winter, come out of hibernation, and then be able to go hunt insects again. So they need to use those fat stores really slowly. So they slow down all their metabolic functions, and they likely reduce their immune system function. So that'll be important when I talk about another thing in a little bit. Okay, so other bats migrate. So if you don't have insects where you live in the summer, you can either hibernate, and just not needing to eat, or you can migrate to where food is available in the winter. So we have a number of bats that migrate long distances to Mexico in some cases, perhaps Central America. We don't exactly know because we haven't done a lot of long distance migratory studies, but we're working on that now. And others will move to places like the coast where the winters aren't as long or as cold, and there are insects available at least regularly through the winter. So for example, in California, where I am, we know that hoary bats come and migrate into the state and then are around throughout the winter. And they will kind of go into torpor, which isn't hibernation. They just kind of shut down a little bit for periods of time if it gets cold and there aren't insects. But as soon as it warms up enough to have insects flying, they'll be back out hunting. Sometimes bats will actually migrate to a place that's better for hibernation. So you have short distance migration between basically the summer roost, and then they go to their winter hibernacula, say up in the Northeast. Other places, they actually migrate from a place that's not going to get cold enough for them to hibernate to a colder place, like maybe higher up in the mountains. So lots of different strategies to deal with, not needing to eat insects and maybe not having them all the time. Okay, so biggest threat to bats really is us and what we are doing to habitats that bats depend on. There are a lot of people in the world, and we don't always, I think, make the best choices in terms of how we're going to share space with the other inhabitants of the earth. So things that happen to affect bats include land conversion without regeneration. So if you clear a forest and it doesn't get replanted, that affects both roosts, because a lot of bats do use trees to roost in. It also affects their foraging areas. You can have cave modification. This can be from mining, from ecotourism, where people are not taking care to not disturb the bats. Modification of airflow can change temperatures and water humidity levels in caves, and that can make them not as good for the bats. Trash, unfortunately. Also, climate change is resulting in more catastrophic loss of tree roosts from hurricanes and wind events. Again, that's land conversion, not by us coming through and cutting down the trees, but by us doing things to change the climate, which is then resulting in these higher levels of catastrophic storms. And then building collapse and demolition is something that you might not think of as affecting bats, but it turns out that bats have come to rely in some places on these anthropogenic or human-created structures. And if you have a bat roost that has a lot of bats, because they are long-lived and very slow to reproduce, many of them only have one pup a year, so it takes a long time to recover if you lose, a big colony of bats. So that's another place where we're trying to get people to think about how they're doing building roost demolition or exclusion, and then, where possible, providing alternate roosts. Pesticides are a big problem. They're a big problem actually for all of us. Things like organochlorines, which collect in the fat cells of bats, or the fat cells of anybody who's consuming or being exposed to them, collect in the fat cells. And then when they eat contaminated prey or drink from contaminated water sources, that's when they collect the pesticides in their fat cells. But then when they're metabolizing the fat quickly, like when they're in migration or they're in reproduction and they're using high levels of energy and using that fat store really quickly, those pesticide levels can spike, and then that can actually have impacts on their behavior, on their immune system, on their health. Sometimes it can even kill them outright. And it can be transmitted through milk to the young, because again, as they said earlier, bats are mammals, and so they feed their young, they nurse their young. So industrial air and water pollution also have impacts. Some of them are similar to the impacts of pesticides. Some of them are more direct, poisoning. Water pollution is especially problematic because bats are very dependent on, water for drinking, and they, again, because they fly, they use high rates of energy. Whatever they're taking in tends to kind of get processed through their system quickly, and if it's something that then will impact them badly, that's a problem. So cyanide poisoning is one example. This is a serious threat to wildlife, including bats. And you wouldn't think that cyanide is something that, you know, we're talking about, except maybe if you're reading a mystery novel and someone's poisoning someone. But it turns out that for mining, for example, for gold and silver, cyanide turns out to be the most efficient way to extract those metals from the ore that they're in. And those ponds, if they're not handled really carefully and covered and not accessible to wildlife, actually can result in poisoning of wildlife, all kinds of wildlife, including bats. Disturbance is another problem. Disturbance at roosting sites has caused maternity colonies to abandon their roosts and has been clearly linked in many cases to population declines of hibernating bat colonies. And disturbance, unfortunately, in some cases can be just people going in and they don't mean to hurt the bats, but they go in and they have lights and they maybe change the temperature and they alarm the bats wake up, they burn through some of their fat stores, and then they don't always make it all the way through the winter. However, when roosts are protected from disturbance, the bat populations often rebound. There have been a number of cases where large roosts that had declined by 90% were gated, protected. People couldn't go in at certain times of the year, and those roosts have come back. So there are things we can do about that. Wind energy is another issue in some areas and for some species, especially it appears bats like hoary bats may see the turbines as an interesting feature to be investigated. And because they're strong flyers, they actually can be flying out when it's windy and the turbines are operating. So another big impact to bats in North America is a disease called white nose syndrome. This is a picture here. I don't know if you can, on the left, these are all bat carcasses of bats in a colony that had been hit by this disease. And the picture on the right is a picture of a bat that has this disease. And I will talk about what it is. It is a fungal disease. It's caused by a cold-loving fungus. It affects hibernating bats. So the bats that don't hibernate are not impacted by this. It is caused by an invasive cold-loving fungus, which arrived in, actually, I'll talk about when it arrived in just a minute. And it's spread across most of North America now, and it's killed over 7 million bats. It's affecting multiple species of bats, but again, they're all hibernating bats. And it's not a threat to humans, pets, or livestock. What we know about the white nose syndrome fungus is it's a newly described fungal species called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which we refer to as PD because it's much easier and shorter to say. It invades the skin tissue of hibernating bats. And do you remember earlier when I said that one of the things that bats do in hibernation is their immune system may be a little bit suppressed? That is one of the reasons why this fungus can grow on hibernating bats, is they are not mounting a response to kick the fungus out of their skin, that basically their immune system's suppressed and that fungus can grow, and it causes a number of problems. It wakes them up. Like, I don't know if any of you have had a mosquito bite or a poison oak or something that is itching and you just can't get to sleep, or you wake up, you maybe get to sleep, you wake up and then you start itching again and you can't go back to sleep for a while. So that's what happens to the hibernating bats. They wake up too often and they waste their stored body fat. And those bats that in that picture that I showed just a minute ago, those bats simply starved to death before they could, before there were insects out, before winter ended and they could get out and find food. The fungus has been found, I mean, it's definitely come from Europe. It's been found in European and Asian bats, but doesn't seem to cause mortality. And it's likely that those bats have developed a resistance to the fungus or behavioral ways to live with it. The fungus has been in Europe for, they estimate, 10,000 years. So our bats simply haven't seen it, and they don't know, they don't have ways to deal with the fungus without basically, dying. So, but again, it doesn't affect all species the same. So white nose is not an ordinary wildlife disease. Few diseases have affected as many species over such a large geographic area in such a short period of time. One similar sort of story is chytrid fungus in amphibians. And the interesting thing to note is that they are both fungal diseases. And it turns out fungal diseases can be fairly hard to treat. So there are 12 species confirmed with white nose syndrome in the US. There are about 8 other species that have been found with the fungus on them, but no sign of the disease. And most of those don't hibernate, or they have shorter hibernation periods, or they wake up regularly. Like their normal way of being is to wake up at a few times during the winter and come out and feed and then go back. So real quickly, the first evidence of white nose in North America was in February of 2006 in a show cave up in Schoharie County, New York. And by the spring of 2020, it had spread throughout North America and Canada, US and Canada, in Washington. And the fungus has been detected at very low levels in California, but we do not have the disease yet. We don't know what's going to happen in the West in terms of impacts to our bats, because again, we seem to have a little bit of a different hibernation pattern, but stay tuned. So just really quickly, how is PD transmitted? Likely there's a lot of bat-to-bat transmission. So bats will go to summer swarming colonies. This is the hibernacula where the bats were first discovered. And this is an example of how far the bats, sorry, I was using the cursor on a different screen, how far the bats from that winter colony went to their summer colonies. So as you can see, you can have a lot of bats in a hibernacula where they're picking up the PD fungus, and then they fly out to all of these different summer roosts, and then they could then share that fungus with the other bats. It also can be transmitted by people. So movement of people from cave to cave, or people visiting caves or places where the fungus is, and not decontaminating or using new gear before going on to another location where the bats could be. So what are the impacts of white nose on hibernating populations? Well, it has devastated certain species with huge declines, 99% in northern long-eared bat. This used to be one of, so this is the northern long-eared bat. This used to be one of the most common bats found when people would go out and mist net for bats, and people were like, oh yeah, another northern long-eared bat. Rarely do people catch this bat in mist nets anymore. So 93%, 99%, 96%, 90%. But as I said, not all bats are affected the same. So big brown bats have had declines, it looks like, of about 21%. And the thought is that it's partly size. The big brown bat is a much larger bat than the other 4. Maybe their hibernation behavior, their patterns of where they hibernate in a cave, perhaps it's partly behavior, we just don't know. This is just a quick visual of the 2005, before white nose came through. This was a hibernacula in New York. The next year there was starting to be some decline. You can see these patches where you could tell the bats had been there before, but they weren't anymore. 2010, here, you can see again where the bats had been before. 2011, what seems to be happening is that there are some places where bats are collecting again in good hibernacula. So this doesn't necessarily mean that there's an increase. It may mean that the bats are coming from other hibernacula to this place because it's the right conditions. So anyway, but this is one of the caves that I think had about a 93% decline. So just another example, Mount Aeolus Cave in Vermont, used like historically way long ago, had up to 300,000 bats. There was one particular location, Guano Hall, that typically had 1,000 to 3,000 bats, and in 2010 there were 35 bats there. So it's really been devastating for biologists that work in these areas. So what does this mean when we're having this kind of population impact? And as I said, bats are the primary predator of night-flying insects. So losing that pest control services could cost farmers billions. Again, on corn crops alone, there was a study that said that farmers probably save $1 billion annually on pesticides that they don't have to use. There may be impacts to the forest products industry because bats could be actually providing some pest control services for trees. And additional pesticide use having to be used that is going to have environmental and human health impacts. Hibernating bats are an important part of cave ecosystems. It turns out that bat guano provides nutrients and minerals and things like that for other cave organisms. And then just the loss of species diversity is diversity is important, and the loss of any species is something that I think we should try to avoid. So what are we doing about white nose? We have a really large and dedicated cooperative response. Again, agencies, non-governmental organizations, citizen science, tribes, lots of folks in Canada and the US are working together on this. There's a lot of research going on where we've developed recommendations for decontamination and how to approach working in caves. There's been a little bit of work on captive management. Bats are very hard to keep in captivity, at least the microbats. So that's not something that we've been pursuing. And the populations are not to the point where that would make sense, but it is something that people have looked at. So really what a lot of folks are focusing on is protecting and conserving habitat so that the bats that are surviving have the best chance of being able to thrive and recover their populations, especially because there is reason for hope. Bats with damaged wings do heal. So this shows healing time. So you can have, this is the total area of a wing that was damaged. And then this was bats that had been brought into captivity. And as I said, they're hard to keep a captive colony for a long time, but they actually do okay for short periods of time in captivity. And this is showing that all of these bats healed almost completely within a month of being brought into captivity. So here's an example of a big tear in this wing, and about 3 weeks later, it was healed up and essentially fully functional. The other thing I'll say is bats are amazing. They can fly with remarkably damaged wings. And I think it's because they have so much control over the muscles in their wings that they can kind of work around having a hole in their wing. But it is pretty spectacular that they can do that. So a lot of people are also working, as I said, on habitat restoration and roost protection projects. Generally, there's much better acceptance and knowledge about bats, so people are interested in helping them. White nose resistance is showing up. It looks like there are some individuals of even species that were really impacted, and then some entire species that are resistant to the disease. And there are a number of potential treatments being explored. And I mentioned wind turbines. There are options for wind turbine operation that reduce bat fatalities. And people are working on trying to, figure out different ways of reducing pesticide use. So what can you do? I'm going to finish this, and then I have a couple slides that I wasn't able to put in. Again, as I said, I had a bit of a security snafu with my PowerPoint. So I might stick in a couple of extra things as I'm going through these last couple of slides. But what can you do? I think really importantly, you can educate yourself and others about bats. You can provide bats safe roosting habitat, for example, bat houses if appropriate. Encourage people to think about whether there are ways to protect areas where bats may be roosting. Take note of bats in your area. Report new bat colonies to state wildlife agencies. There are also in different parts of the country, regional sort of citizen science bat groups, and you can join those, or if you can look online, you can contact any of the white nose coordinators. We're happy to, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're happy to pass you on to local groups in your area. If you see bats behaving oddly, and I would say this particularly for folks who live in areas where it gets really snowy in the winter and bats are likely to be hibernating, if you see bats out in the winter in the snow, that's something that you would want to report to your state wildlife agency. Bats flying in the daytime, roosting in sunlight on the outside of structures, that's unusual. It's not that it never happens with a bat that's otherwise okay, but you do want to keep an eye on that. If you see a bat on the ground that's been injured, you can find a local rehabber or contact your state wildlife agency. Don't ever pick up a bat with your bare hands, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. What else can you do? If you're an adventurer who likes to explore caves or mines, please check with state conservation agencies before visiting those places for the latest information on how to avoid spreading the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. And be sure to decontaminate your gear, your shoes, your clothes before and after each visit to caves and mines. And you can visit whitenosesyndrome.org for the latest info on that. And it also has links to all of the state wildlife agencies in your area. You can plant a pesticide-free native wildflower garden that will provide bats with healthy insects to eat. During the day, you'll have butterflies, dragonflies, bees, and birds visiting the garden. And at night, bats will eat the moths and beetles that come to feast on the plants or lay eggs. And sometimes if you plant night blooming flowers, those can attract insects. And if you happen to live in an area where you might have some of the pollinating bats, so in the far southwestern part of the US, you can also, those night blooming flowers can provide bats with nectar. Okay, so remember, bats are wild animals and they may bite if they feel threatened. So don't touch a bat with bare hands. Bats, like all mammals, can contract rabies. They actually have a pretty low incidence. It's interesting because everybody thinks of bats and rabies, and I think part of the reason of that is that bats are small. They tend to get the paralytic form of rabies, so they fall on the ground and they're easy to pick up, unlike skunks or raccoons or foxes, or which tend to be extremely aggressive if they get rabies, and people are less likely to try to pick up a skunk or a raccoon, which you should never do because they're wild animals. But if you do see a bat that is down or is acting oddly, if you have a local wildlife rehab, contact them and they can put you in touch with someone, or they can come and get the bat, or contact your state wildlife agency. And if anyone has had contact with the bat and you do not know, whether the bat did bite someone, you can also contact your local health department. But do teach people to care about bats. Okay, so thank you. What I'm going to do really quickly is, let me see if I can pull up this other slide, because one of the things that I want to bring up is the question of COVID. Can you guys see this okay? Frankie, can you see this new slide?
Yes, we can see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what about COVID? There's been a lot of conversation about bats and COVID, and there's been a lot of people saying, oh, it's, the bats, it came from the bats. So as I mentioned before, bats are natural hosts to a number of viruses, including coronaviruses, and their immune system is amazing, and they can handle those viruses, and they often just live with them in their systems, and they don't get sick from them. So the SARS-CoV-2, which is what is causing the disease COVID, is closely related to a virus that's found in horseshoe bats, but it's not the exact same virus. And there are other wildlife that also can be host to coronaviruses. And there's some evidence that there's another coronavirus in a different animal species, a pangolin, which is a heavily trafficked animal, which means a lot of times they're caught and killed for eating or using their scales in various ways. And so there's some evidence that those two coronavirus may have recombined to create the SARS-CoV-2, but we don't really know. We don't actually know how it got from whatever the original ancestors of the SARS-CoV-2, and then got to humans. It may well have been through wildlife coming in contact that they wouldn't otherwise, and then coming in contact with humans. So I really want to say that bats with any coronaviruses in the wild are not a threat to human health if they're protected and left undisturbed. So bats and other wildlife do not spread the disease, the COVID or SARS-CoV-2, to humans. Only humans spread COVID-19 to other humans. And conservation of bats and their habitats actually helps create a healthier and safer world. Research into bats and their special abilities to not get sick from many viruses could actually hold the key to the next breakthrough vaccine or treatment. So one of the lessons of the pandemic is that disturbances to wildlife and destruction of habitats make it more likely for viruses to spill into humans. And so again, while the exact chain of transmission that resulted in COVID-19 may never be established, we do know that new pathogens are more likely to spill into human populations when nature is disrupted and disturbed. Although COVID-19 has been one of the most dramatic examples recently of a virus spilling over into humans, this isn't the first time it's happened, and it's going to increase as we continue to destroy habitats, exploit wildlife. So we really need to, we're healthier and safer in a world where we can conserve wildlife and natural habitats. And bat conservation is part of the solution, because when we protect bats, we stay safer too. Okay, thank you. And now I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, there's one here, and it says, have you ever seen a hognose bat?
Sadly, I have not. I've actually never been to Burma or Thailand. Someday, but I have. Okay, so am I not sharing anymore? Is it just me now?
Yes.
Okay,
it's just you.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. No, I have not. So someday.
There's another question from the YouTube channel, and it says, do you have a favorite cave story?
A favorite cave story? Well, I actually do. So I don't know. I live in California, and one of the places where we do a fair amount of work on bats is in Lava Beds National Monument. If you ever get the chance to come to California once travel is safer again, Lava Beds is an awesome place to go. It has all kinds of lava tube caves, and it has a lot of bats that use those caves in the summer for maternity colonies, and also in the winter in some cases for hibernacula. I got to work on a project that was looking both at bat activity in those caves, but also it was to set up a 3D model of the cave so that visitors who couldn't visit Lava Beds in person could have a virtual tour of the cave. So we got to go in, with our helmets on and our headlamps, and we were using laser, basically a LiDAR kind of laser measuring system to map the 3D contours of the cave. So we got to spend all day in these lava tubes, and you have to kind of clamber down into them and then make your way through, and essentially they created a 3D model of a couple of these caves, and we got to see bats roosting in so lava, if you think about it, it kind of bubbles sometimes, and in these lava tubes there would be places where there'd be a bubble that would then burst, and they create these little tiny rounded holes that are in the caves, and these little tiny bat faces would be in these holes. And actually, that's one of the slides that didn't get into my presentation because it reverted to an old version, was a picture of these two little tiny bat faces kind of sticking out of this round hole. So that's my favorite cave story.
Thank you. Here's another question. What is being done to help bats avoid wind turbines?
So there's a lot of research going on. So there are two different avenues going on. One is to figure out a way to shut down the wind turbines during the time that bats are at highest risk. So there's a lot of research on when are bats flying through certain areas. Are there conditions like wind speed, meteorological conditions? Did a storm just come through? Is there a certain temperature that they'll be flying at? And the hope is that we can figure out a way to say, okay, if the conditions are like this, we'll shut the turbines down, and then they're not a risk to the bats, because the bats don't just run into them. Unfortunately, birds sometimes do, but bats are definitely coming to inspect the turbines, and they seem to get hit by the blades moving. The other thing that there's a lot of research on, and I hope will work, because then you wouldn't have to shut the turbines down and you could continue to get the energy that's produced from the wind turbines all the time without shutting them down, is deterrence. So they're working on sound that's high frequency that interferes with the bat's echolocation. And the idea is that the bats will be like, oh, I don't want to go there. I can't see, because they can't detect the echoes coming back. So that's what they're doing. Two different things. One is to operationally say, under certain conditions, we'll shut the turbines down, and that will keep the bats from getting killed. And then the other, and I think everybody is hoping will end up working, is a deterrent, so that the bats will just go around the turbines and the turbines can continue to produce power.
Here's another question. When bats migrate, do they migrate in large numbers? And have you seen them when they're migrating?
So I haven't seen them personally, like when they're migrating, but I have seen evidence of their migration through acoustic surveys. So one of the things that we're working on, and actually this is a citizen science thing that if anybody's interested in, please reach out to me, or again, if you Google North American Bat Monitoring Program, you can get information there as well. It's probably maybe easier to just contact me, for example, and I can put you in touch with the right people. But so there's a big monitoring network going on in North America with acoustic detectors put up. And one of the things we're finding is that we'll have periods of time when there are a lot of bat calls of a certain species coming through, say, a river or canyon, and it's only in the fall or it's only in the spring. And so there's evidence of migration there. There actually are old accounts of people seeing what they referred to as flocks of bats. Red bats and hoary bats are two tree roosting species that they do clearly have migratory patterns. And so those bats have been seen in flocks in the spring and the fall. But again, it's not like bird migration where you see, a whole bunch of them in the sky or anything like that. We really have to use things like acoustic monitoring to detect them because we can't see them. And they often are migrating really, really high. So even if we were out at night, say with night vision goggles, we probably wouldn't be able to see them.
One more question, I think. If you put bat boxes in your yard, do you have to worry about your pets eating the droppings from the that fall from the bat boxes?
So no. So I know that sometimes people hear about there's another fungal disease, all these fungi that we need to worry about, called histoplasmosis, that sometimes people will talk about worrying about with bat guano. Histoplasmosis is much more common in bird droppings, and it really can't grow unless there's a large quantity of the droppings and there's moisture that the fungus can kind of live in. So it's actually really rare to have histoplasmosis in bat guano. In fact, I think, it's been a while since I've really looked at it, but I think a lot of the places where histoplasmosis was found and bats were found, there were also birds in the area. So, but no, you don't need to worry about. What you do need to worry about is make sure your pets are vaccinated for rabies, which they should be anyway, because if there's skunks or foxes or raccoons, as well as bats, you want to make sure they're protected. So if your pets are vaccinated for rabies, that's fine, but you don't want them to, like, if a bat is down on the ground, you don't want your pet to grab it. So just, think about that when you're putting up bat boxes. And I would really recommend going to Bat Conservation International and looking at their information about bat boxes, because they have a lot of details about where you should put them, where is most likely for bats to actually be able to use them, what kind of bats use bat houses as opposed to, say, using tree crevices. And the bats that use tree crevices might not move into a bat house because it doesn't really look like the kind of house that they would use. So, but again, happy to answer more questions about that if you want to contact me later. And Bat Conservation International has a lot of info on that. So let's see. I see a question by Neva. How many bats are killed each day by the disease? We don't really know that. It's very much the estimate of 7 million bats is based on the numbers of bats found dead at hibernacula and the reduction in bats heard in the summer when people are doing acoustic surveys, and also the number of bats at maternity colonies in the summer. So we have to extrapolate, based on how many maternity colonies people are counting the bats at, and then people know about other maternity colonies, and same with hibernacula. So we don't have an exact number. Melanie asks, when a vampire bat bites the birds, do they usually recover? So most of the animals that are fed on by vampire bats do recover, because it's not, well, first of all, it wouldn't be in the interest of the vampire bats to kill the animals that they're feeding on, because then they wouldn't have them to feed on again. Let's see. Sorry, Frankie, did you want me to?
Sorry, I think that was all the questions right there.
Okay,
So,
no, sorry, no, that's fine. I'm going to finish answering. Something popped up on the thing, and I didn't know if you were.
oh,
So,
sorry, I was.
no, that's fine. Anyway, yes, they usually do recover. There is some concern again with vampire bats because they can sometimes carry rabies, passing rabies to, for example, livestock. So folks are actually working on a vaccine against rabies that they could go and put on the bodies of vampire bats in a colony because they groom each other, kind of like cats. And, if you have a couple cats, they sometimes will groom each other. And then it's an oral vaccine. The vampire bats lick it off, and then they all would be vaccinated against rabies, and then they couldn't transmit it to the livestock. So that would be great because it would reduce people feeling like they needed to destroy vampire bat colonies because they wouldn't have to worry about their animals getting getting rabies from a vampire bat. All right. Well, thank you so much.
I think you've answered all of our questions. I want to thank you very much for telling us all about bats today and participating in our International Day of Women and Girls in Science. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And please pass on my email. I'm happy to get contacted if anybody wants other info.
Thank you very much. Okay. Have a good day.